So today I want to talk about how white writers can write whiteness in a way that is anti-racist. I am not an expert and I do not have all the answers figured out, but I will do my best to share what I think I've learned about this topic. How to be anti-racist as a white author is something that I ruminate on a lot. And so in case it's valuable to any of you, I want to share just sort of the types of questions that I ask myself and my best attempts at some answers. And in the description to this video, I'll link to lots of great articles by people who know a lot more than me. Over the last few days, I've really wrestled over whether it's even appropriate for me to post this video right now, or am I trying to capitalize on the pain that the Black community in America is currently experiencing? From listening to my Black friends expressing disappointment and anger over the silence of their white friends in the wake of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery on social media, I've decided that it's worthwhile to try to speak out and to use what small voice I have on this platform and on Twitter to address my fellow white writers about how we might address racism in our work. My channel isn't big enough to monetize, so I don't get any money off of this, but this is the kind of video that I will never monetize, regardless if I ever get there. The day I'm filming this is just a few days after Ahmaud Arbery's murderers were finally arrested, 74 days after he was murdered for the crime of jogging outside while Black. It's a few days after Sean Reed was murdered by police in Indianapolis, who claimed that he exchanged gunfire with them, even though a Facebook Live video showed that to be a lie. And we're in the midst of a national genocide by a pandemic and neglect of the government to care for people in this pandemic. Black people are 4 times more likely to die of the coronavirus than white people because of structural inequalities. Black people are more likely to be in essential high-risk service jobs. They have a greater lack of access to healthcare, and there are racial biases among medical professionals that have been well documented. Because Black neighborhoods suffer from systemic environmental justice, they're often located near chemical refineries and highways that pollute the air they breathe, leading to higher rates of asthma and respiratory illnesses that make COVID-19 more dangerous. Amidst this cultural context, my little corner of the world is the writing communities. And I think it's important that we talk right now about how we can be anti-racist in our writing. And so when it comes to anti-racist writing, the first question that white authors need to ask themselves is, do you care? As a white writer, do you care about racial inequality? Do you care to do some work to make sure that your writing, at very least, doesn't enable white supremacy? And do you care to do the work to write in a way that dismantles white supremacy, even if it might be very risky? And let's be real, it's much easier to not care. Caring means you have to acknowledge white privilege and white supremacy, which is psychologically uncomfortable. It probably means giving up some comforting fantasies about history and how the world works and your country and your identity. Caring will mean recognizing that some of your favorite books and movies have really problematic racial elements. But if you're interested in truth as a writer, if you got into this because you believe that books can change the world and you want to be a part of that, if you're committed to leaving this world better than you found it, then you have to care. So I'm going to do this video assuming that 1, you care, and 2, you're on board with Black Lives Matter. And I'm going to be speaking specifically about anti-Black racism today, but these sorts of principles and ideas apply to any sort of marginalization you don't share. If you want to confront racism against any group, ableism, anti-LGBTQ hate, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hate, the patriarchy, anti-fat hatred, these same sorts of principles would all apply. I think the first thing you have to do as a white author, if you want to do anti-racist work and you care about doing anti-racist writing, is to acknowledge your white privilege and your white fragility. That has to be step 1. So let's talk about what is white privilege and specifically how does it apply to authors. We live in a world that is obscenely stratified because of the actions of white European colonists hundreds of years ago. They began a worldwide genocide and the enslavement of people of color that extended to every corner of the globe. They began hoarding the wealth of the world and living lives of previously unthinkable luxury on the backs of slaves in faraway colonies. And that society persists to this day. That society has not ended. If you live in the United States of America like me, the foods you eat, the clothes you wear, and many of the goods you consume are still produced somewhere in the supply chain by slaves. Literally slaves. They might be prison inmates who have no choice about working, or people receiving wages so negligible that it's de facto slavery. Textiles, electronics, clothing, produce, chocolate, coffee, and meat are all industries that rely on forced labor or wage slavery. The energy that powers your home, the plastics you consume, are all produced at chemical refineries, which are overwhelmingly located in poor Black and brown neighborhoods. And if you're white, you most likely had an enormous privilege in your education. You probably attended a mostly white school, statistically speaking, and those schools often receive thousands more dollars per student than primarily Black schools. If you live in a mostly white neighborhood, there will be exceptions, but probably the air you breathe and the water you drink is most likely cleaner, leading to fewer health problems. The streets you drive on are better maintained, causing you to have fewer financial setbacks and car repairs. When you apply for a job, studies have shown you're far more likely to get an interview if your name sounds white. You can go out jogging or walking or driving or sit in your house without fear the cops will murder you just for the color of your skin. And I can go on and on. As a white person in America, these are the types of white privilege that are inescapable for you. White privilege doesn't mean that you don't suffer or experience hardships, but it means that you aren't systematically oppressed for the color of your skin. Sure, if you grew up poor, then you face class challenges. If you're disabled and white, you probably experience ableist oppressions, but those don't negate your white privilege. By growing up white, you still benefited from having white skin in a white supremacist country, which is also the wealthiest country in a heavily colonized world. And that's just something that we can't get away from. And I think it comes with some moral obligations to speak out on white supremacy. Now let's talk specifically about white privilege in publishing. There isn't super hard data on the percentage of the amount of racial diversity in the publishing industry among the professionals. The best information that we have is a survey by Lee and Low. The numbers could be, it's opt-in, so the numbers are not necessarily 100% accurate. If anything, they probably skew towards companies trying to represent themselves as more diverse than they really are. But according to that survey, 76% of people in the industry overall are white people, which means that if you're contacting an agent or a editor, they're most likely going to be a white person, and they're probably going to have a racial bias towards stories that reflect their own experiences and attitudes. And so as a white author contacting mostly white publishers and agents, you're going to have an advantage. That plays out in the numbers of the types of books that are getting published. The vast majority of books are being published by white authors, and the vast majority of characters that are being put out into the world are white. And the problem is especially obvious in kid lit. A greater percentage of children's books that came out in 2018 featured an animal protagonist than a child of color. So clearly, just based on the numbers alone, you're far more likely to get a book deal, to get published as a white author. You're far more likely to be working with publishing professionals who are white than working with a person of color. And so any sort of claim that white authors are going to make that they're at a disadvantage for being white, no, shut it down. That is not accurate. You have a huge advantage just from the fact that you're white. Probably, let's talk about the kinds of things that make it possible to be a writer in the US. One, you have to have the time and space to write, meaning you have to have a job that affords you some amount of emotional and creative energy at the end of the day, or some amount of flexibility to be able to get writing done. Or you're really lucky like me and you're privileged to have a spouse who supports you. Many of the authors that I know from college who went on to publish books in their 20s had parents supporting them during those years. And they were white and privileged and had trust funds. And so they could sit around for 5 years working on a first manuscript before they got published. And that's just kind of the reality. Other privileges that white authors have, again, going back to the schools, white people overwhelmingly go to schools that are better funded than Black schools. And so you need to have had the type of education that taught you the standard rules of grammar in order to break into this world. Now, at this point, maybe you're already starting to feel uncomfortable. And that feeling is pretty normal for white people. And there's a term for it, which is white fragility. The term white fragility was coined by Robin DiAngelo, and acknowledging your white fragility in addition to your white privilege is a really important part of doing anti-racist work. I'm gonna read a quote from Robin DiAngelo about what it is, and I'll link to the full interview below. When I coined that term, the fragility part was meant to capture how little it takes to upset white people racially. For a lot of white people, the mere suggestion that being white has meaning will cause great umbrage. Certainly generalizing about white people will. Right now, me saying white people as if our race had meaning, as if I could know anything about somebody just because they're white, will cause a lot of white people to erupt in defensiveness. And I think of it as a kind of weaponized defensiveness, weaponized tears, weaponized hurt feelings. And in that way, I think white fragility actually functions as a kind of racial white bullying. We white people make it so difficult for people of color to talk to us about our inevitable but often unaware racist patterns and assumptions that most of the time they don't. People of color working and living in primarily white environments take home way more daily indignities and slights and microaggressions than they bother talking to us about, because their experience consistently tells them that it's not going to go well. In fact, they're going to risk more punishment, not less. They're going to now have to take care of the white person's upset feelings. They're going to be seen as a troublemaker. The white person is going to withdraw, defend, explain, and insist it had to have been a misunderstanding. So I think that that's a great description of what white fragility is. So if this video is making you feel uncomfortable, you just have to learn to sit in that feeling and that uncomfortableness and be willing to listen and hear openly and not get defensive about the fact that you're white. I'm not saying, by saying that you have white privilege, I'm not saying you're a slave owner. I'm not saying you're evil. I'm saying you have white privilege, and you need to learn to be able to sit with that understanding and not get really defensive. Let's go through some steps of what you can do as a white author to become more aware of your whiteness and to be more anti-racist. Again, not an expert, not saying I have all the answers, but here are some things that I think would help. The first one is to extensively read and listen to Black voices. So I would recommend going to your bookshelf, maybe even physically making two piles, or maybe you want to eyeball it, but go ahead and stack up the number of books that you have by white authors, and then stack up the number of books you have by Black authors. And how would those piles match up? And would the matchup of those piles reflect the racial demographics of this country? I was challenged to do that about 5 years ago and realized that I had 1 or 2 books by Black authors on my shelves. And I set about, realizing how ignorant I was, I set about really trying to actively read a ton of Black nonfiction and fiction. And I'm gonna post up some of the books that have been most influential for me in understanding racial politics and developing my commitment to anti-racism. I don't have many of these books physically with me still because I'm a big book giver. I do try to buy new books to support emerging authors, but then I give them away to my friends or to students or to libraries. And then I also, for books by dead authors, I tend to go through the library, so I don't have those with me. But one book, Assata, an autobiography by Assata Shakur. If you're not committed to prison abolitionism, this is a great place to start. When They Call You a Terrorist by Patrisse Khan-Cullors is about the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that was hugely eye-opening to me. Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis. This was a really important book to me. It draws parallels between the anti-Black racism advocacy movement in the US and the struggle for a free Palestine in Israel. And like as a Jewish American, I really needed to read that, and that book really entrenched my commitment to a free Palestine. Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates is often included on these types of lists, and that was also really powerful. There are 2 books that really changed how I understood my complicity in white supremacy as a white teacher in a predominantly Black charter school that I was working with at the time. One was For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood by Christopher Emdin. And one I still have with me was this book from college, my Texas School Finance Reform textbook. This was from, I got a master's degree in school administration and became so sort of disgusted with the school system that, anyways, I'm not teaching anymore for lots of reasons. But this book, wow, wow, our school's funded like so racistly, and learning just what the actual law, the way it's set up so sneakily to benefit white schools at the expense of Black schools is just disgusting, and it was so eye-opening for me. Those are some nonfiction books that have been really influential. In terms of fiction, I don't have any of these because I've given them all away. Homegoing, Black Boy, Song of Solomon, For Black Girls Like Me, which is by a friend of mine from high school, Mariama Lockington. She's amazing. And Unkindness of Ghosts, the 5th season, Their Eyes Were Watching God, Here Comes the Sun, and Loving Day are all 5-star reads and were hugely influential to me. In addition to reading Black books, as an author participating in social media online, you should make an effort to follow Black writers. Following them on social media, you'll learn a lot about biases and stuff in the publishing industry, and you can support them and uplift their voices and help them in their careers just by, retweeting their tweets, helping them promote their books. That's a great way, I think, white authors can show up for non-white authors. Mostly on Twitter, like I have a big number of YA writers that I'm following because I got into Twitter to start creating my book in YA. So some Black writers in YA who I think are really great voices that white authors should learn from are Jason Reynolds, Emery Lee, Mariama Lockington, Elizabeth Acevedo, Angie Thomas, N.K. Jemisin, and Nnedi Okorafor. And I would love for people in the comments to drop the links of more authors. Something else that white writers need to make sure they do on social media is not take up space reserved for people of color. When you see a call for submissions from a magazine or a publishing company or an agent looking for own voices works, own voices stories or stories from people of color, don't try to pass yourself off as part of that group if you are not one of them. I've heard from people like Beth Phelan on Twitter that this is a big problem, that when calls go out for books by Black authors, there are white writers that will write in saying well, I'm not Black, but I have an eating disorder, so this book is also about diversity. No, you are trying to take up space. Space is being set aside for people of color. You're trying to move into that space. That is a hostile act, and you need to back down and, not do that. Another important thing that white writers need to do is not just show up. It's not enough to show up on social media. Attend direct actions for the Black community. If you are going to be committed to anti-racist work in your writing, you need to live out anti-racist work in your real life. Vote for candidates who support anti-racism, not just in lip service. Be politically active in ways that support racial justice and equality. Most major cities in the country have a SURGE group, which stands for Showing Up for Racial Justice. And that's specifically a group of white people. They usually work in coordination with the Black Lives Matter in your community. Make sure you're following SURGE and Black Lives Matter for your local community on your social medias and show up to their events, participate in their campaigns. If they're asking you to call politicians about something, take 30 seconds or a minute of your time and support that action. Now, finally, and this is going to be the bulk of the video, how do we make sure our writing isn't racist? And then we'll go a step further and say, how can we make sure our writing is anti-racist? Let's talk about some problematic tropes and narratives. And all that research and listening to the Black community and reading Black authors and listening to them both in their published books and online will hopefully help you avoid some of these pitfalls. But here's a few to know to highlight. So the first one is to avoid racial stereotypes. And if you've gotten this far in watching this video and you're still on board with me, I'm imagining you're probably avoiding really obviously toxic stereotypes like the welfare queen or a thug. But even stereotypes that we think are coded as positive can be harmful. For example, the sassy Black friend that you see in every rom-com from the 2000s. Also the magical Black person, like you see in The Green Mile or The Legend of Bagger Vance, supporting character who's helping along a white character on their quest. These depictions, even though they seem positive on the surface, are still problematic because they're one note, they're dehumanizing, it's not a real character, it's like an archetype. We need to move away from those. Another problematic trope to avoid is the white savior narrative. So these are so rife in literature, and even in literature that's really celebrated. And yes, I'm coming after you, To Kill a Mockingbird. The white savior narrative centers a white protagonist as necessary to give Black people their freedom. I always didn't like the teaching of To Kill a Mockingbird in 8th grade in the school district I used to work with, and I can never like put my finger on why. At first I just noticed that it really did not connect with the kids. And then I started to think about, well, this is the only book we teach during the Civil Rights Unit. Why is the only book we teach during the Civil Rights Unit for the year by a white author? And all the books we read throughout the course of the year were by white authors. And then we're reading a book about like the struggle for Black rights and freedom, and it's also by a white author. And the hero in the book is a white lawyer who's like saving the Black people in the book from racism. And I realized that, you know, this book is taught by white teachers in Black communities because it upholds a narrative that's mostly false, that white people, yes, there were white racists, but there were enough good people to give Black people their freedom. That's not really how the civil rights movement played out at all. That's not the story. And if you're gonna read one book about the civil rights movement, it should probably be one by a Black author and not To Kill a Mockingbird. Even though these are some of our most celebrated books in literature, unfortunately, the white savior narrative is harmful, and it paints a version of history that really isn't accurate. Another problematic thing to do that's seemingly well-intentioned, but actually really problematic, is exploiting Black pain. An example of this from the world of fine arts is Dana Schutz's painting Open Casket, which was a painting of Emmett Till, who was lynched by being beaten to death. And she is a white woman who painted his body. Basically, if you're white, don't write a book trying to explain Black people's pain. You need to ask yourself, do I have the life experiences to tell this story? Or would a Black author tell this story better? If the answer is yes, then it's probably not your story to tell. And when gruesome graphic depictions of Black suffering come from a white author, it just re-traumatizes the Black community for the consumption of a white audience. So don't do this. Often Black people's suffering and death is used as a plot device to either like move the plot forward or to motivate a white character. Some examples are Rue's death in The Hunger Games, Missandei's death in Game of Thrones. The Black character has to die to, for the purpose of the white character's catharsis. It's really transparent. Don't do it. There's also some genre-specific problems in trying to solve racism by using aliens, supernatural beings, or magic. So some people have magic, some people don't, and they hate each other for this. Other worlds have served as like a safer seeming backdrop to tackle racial issues, but these depictions are often overly simplified or problematic. Often the solution in these stories boils down to like, don't you see that racism is silly? Just get along. And again, there's usually like a white savior, coming to this alien planet or into this supernatural world from the outside. And all it took was realizing we have more in common than we have differences to get along. That doesn't reflect the reality of racism in America or the world, which is that we have a legacy of centuries of structural inequality. Our entire economic and political system is founded on this inequality. Racism is so entrenched and it's so difficult to break free from. And this isn't a case of, two different looking peoples who just have prejudice towards each other. That's not what's going on. And usually you don't see structural inequality depicted in these types of narratives. They're really simplifying it. Also, these plot devices often only serve to underscore the idea that Black and white people are somehow fundamentally different. If you're playing out racial politics in a setting where like white people are minotaurs and Black people are fairies and they're at war with each other, like what you're really saying is that we're fundamentally different species, and that's a big problem. So those are the more sort of obviously problematic tropes that we should be avoiding. There's also some like safe ways to write about race. These are currently socially very acceptable in publishing. You'll see them very often. However, I don't think they're necessarily very helpful to our conversations on race. The first one I'm going to talk about is the magical multiracial suburb. So I think this is the most popular and the safest way for white authors to incorporate diversity into their books. You see it all over TV and movies and visual media, from Clueless to Stranger Things, and a lot of YA books end up looking like this. So you've got a racially diverse friend group. They hang out together and solve a mystery or date, but the topic of race and racial tensions never come up. The people of color in these magical suburbs often have no culture that's distinct from the white people. So their language, fashion, etc. have been whitewashed. If they're Black, they don't speak in African American vernacular English. They've totally assimilated into white culture. So that's one problem with these magical suburbs. The other problem is, for the most part, they don't, statistically speaking, exist. Because of the legacy of redlining and discriminatory real estate practices that continue to this day, combined with the wealth gap between white and Black Americans, multiracial communities are very rare. It's 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, which was signed in 1968, and Americans' neighborhoods are still nearly as segregated as they were then, and I'll link to that article. This isn't to say that diverse friend groups don't exist at all. I have one, but part of that is because I live in Houston, which is really unusual in terms of its diversity. I grew up in a suburb of Chicago that was entirely white, and most neighborhoods in Chicago are way more segregated than I've found here in Houston. Even in Houston, you'll find those really segregated communities. I think that the reason that my friend group is so mixed is because my friends are all like artistic, or we're involved in we're involved in activism, or we're queer. And those groups tend to find commonality together. But even though my friend group is very diverse, race is something that comes up. Unlike in the magical multiracial suburb, where race is never a source of tension or anything anyone talks about, my friends and I talk about race a lot, and they know that they can call me out. It's taken time for them to trust me to be able to do that. When you're friends with people of color, I think you have to earn that trust and make it clear that you're someone who's trustworthy and that they can call you out on any like microaggressions you might commit. And so as a writer, if I'm gonna depict a friend group like mine, I'm not going to try to erase those tensions, those moments of discomfort and learning, because I want that group to be realistic. Another way of writing about racism that I think is very safe is the uber racist straw man. So this is a white character you include in the story who's so extremely over the top racist. You know, they're using the N-word, they're in the Klan, they're just like really obviously capital R racist. They certainly exist, right? But if the purpose of that character's inclusion in your story is to make the other white characters look good by comparison, that could be a problem. Especially if the other white characters never confront their own more subtle forms of racism or their more subtle complicity in white supremacy. If the narrative suggests like, here's this super racist straw man, like this is racism, and as long as you're not this bad, you're a good white person, I think that's problematic, because white moderate liberals still have a lot of work to do if we're going to dismantle white supremacy. So I would push back on that trope. So what should we be writing as white authors if we want to tackle white supremacy? Well, I think we have to write honestly about whiteness from our own experience. This step is really hard and it's really rare, I think. I was trying to think of examples, and I really had a hard time thinking of many, but I did come up with one good one. This book, Blue Front, was written by Martha Collins, who was my poetry teacher in college. It came out in 2006, Blue Front. It's a collection of poems and historical documents related to a lynching her own father witnessed as a 5-year-old boy. She doesn't flinch away from that. She doesn't flinch away from the fact that her father, as a child, witnessed a lynching, that he grew up to espouse some racist attitudes, that legacy passes on to her. And when I read this in 2006, this was before the Black Lives Matter movement started, and I was 20 years old. I hadn't moved to Houston yet. I spent my whole childhood and adolescence in very, very white spaces, and I had not done much thinking at all about my complicity in white supremacy. And I read my poetry teacher's book, and a line she keeps returning to in this book was asked to her by a guide who took her to see the parsonage that was bombed during the Civil Rights era. And he said, "I hope you don't mind my asking, but why would a white person want?" And then she stops there. She never finishes that question, and she never answers it. But that echoed the question that was in my heart as I was reading this in 2006 as a 20-year-old. Why would a white person want to write a book about the lynching of a Black man? Why would a white person want to try to reckon with racism in America in a book of poetry? Blue Front was really powerful to me in showing me that a mentor of mine was grappling with questions of complicity and racial violence, that she thought this is the most important thing she could be thinking about and writing about right now. And I think that was a really important message for me to hear at that age, and set me on this path. There is value in white people writing books like this, and in white people looking unflinchingly at our own whiteness and our own complicity in racial violence, and our families, our family history of complicity and racial violence. I don't think we need any more books to teach us that a Klan member is racist, but I think there is an astonishing lack of books exploring all the gradations of white supremacy among the moderate, well-intentioned liberal. The small microaggressions that white people commit, often in ignorance, the cringeworthy moments every well-meaning white person has when they look back on a memory with greater learned racial insight and think like, oh shit, that was so racist. I think all of us have those moments. To be honest about the privileges that come along with our white skin. This way of writing about whiteness is risky. It's way more risky than just writing the magical multiracial suburb where racism has already been solved, because it makes white audiences uncomfortable. It's gonna make white publishers uncomfortable. It might be more difficult to publish. I've had stories out where I've been trying to write these types of moments, and certain beta readers have encouraged me to take it out, feeling that these moments are so superfluous to the story. But I'm not gonna do that. Again, I don't have all the answers. I don't think that I have figured out how to do this yet. It is an ongoing process, but it is something I'm committed to in my writing. We're not gonna erase racism just by writing worlds where racism doesn't exist. Also, white people are not helping Black people by writing their stories for them. So the best way that white authors can contribute to anti-racism in our writing is by having the courage to look truthfully at our complicity in white supremacy. And by putting it on the page, we can hopefully encourage more white people to understand the world as it is, and then change their actions in politics to align with anti-racist work. So just as like Blue Front was a stepping stone for me, learning more about racial justice, white authors have an obligation to write books that help other white people along towards a politic of racial justice. I hope that this video maybe accomplishes that for even one person. That would be cool. I would also love to learn from the experience of posting this video. So if you have recommendations for other books I should read and other places I should go to learn more, I would love to hear that. I would love to find more examples like this of white authors who are writing whiteness in an anti-racist way. I'd be really curious to read more of those books. In the comments, I see racist comments. If I see people claiming racism doesn't exist and we should all shut up about it. If I see people saying all lives matter, I'm probably gonna delete the comment and block them. But otherwise, I would love to hear your thoughts on how we can write. Again, I'm like not claiming to be an expert. I'm not claiming to have it all figured out. I'm on a journey of learning, and if you can help me learn in the comments, I would really appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Bye.